I'm Jacqueline Friedman. I am the founder and executive director of Educate Us. Educate Us is an organization that is building a powerful movement and doing community organizing and political organizing for sex education around the country. Sean, uh, gonna make me blush. I am so happy to be with you tonight. Um, and to talk about how do we talk about trans rights in a way that people can hear. It couldn't be more important to the work that we do, and I know the work that you all do. And we have the most incredible person here to do it. But before that, I want to do a little housekeeping. The first thing is this event is free. We are glad to have it. We're glad to have our ongoing No Means No series. We do these once a month so that you can learn things that you need to know to be better advocates for sex education. You can always find them on the events page on our website, educateusaction.org, and you can find them after the fact on our YouTube page. And I bet if I know Candace, she's pulling both of those links right now. But the thing that I also want to say is it does cost money to produce them. So if you are able to make a donation to educate us, even $5 or $10, to show your appreciation for these kinds of sessions, and for the work that we do, that is how we keep on doing the work. So just want to say that up front. I also want to say a couple of ground rules. I'm going to introduce Rebecca in a minute. We're going to learn incredible things from Rebecca. We're going to have a little chit chat between us, and then we're going to get to your questions. We always leave a ton of time for Q&A in these sessions because we want to know what you want to learn and make sure you get what you need out of it. Before we do that, I want to say something super clearly because of the topic tonight. This is not the place to ask questions about whether trans people should have rights or anything about whether trans people should exist. This is only for people who already understand that trans people have been real forever and support trans people having the same rights everybody else does and wanting to talk about how we more effectively advocate for those rights. And we are not going to have much margin for folks who are here for the wrong reason. So I just want to say that if you're in the wrong place, if you thought this was going to be a different conversation, feel free to duck out. There are other places on the internet you can find that conversation. This is not what we're into tonight. We have an hour and we want to keep it focused on what we're doing tonight. Okay. I think that is basically it. Candace Hardnett, our lead organizer, is also here. She's going to be moderating the chat and also keeping an eye on the Q&A for us so that we can focus on the conversation with you. And so she may also help lift up questions as we go. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. Rebecca Kling, I don't actually have your bio in front of me. We were just talking about Rebecca and I have been friends and compatriots for quite a while. And Rebecca is the co-lead of the Better World Collaborative. Is that your title? Where she does all kinds of strategery about advocating for trans rights and related issues. There's no better brain on trans rights for my money. She also, for those of you who know how much I'm passionate about deep canvassing, is the person who introduced me to deep canvassing. If you want the lore, I don't, there is no organizer or thinker that I admire more, if I'm being honest. So I'm really honored to have Rebecca with us tonight to share what she knows and what we should all know about how to talk about trans rights in ways that people can actually hear. So, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Good to see you. Glad we have so many folks who are here tonight. I am Rebecca Kling, she, her, and I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat. I am a co-founder and principal at Better World Collaborative. We are a digital communications and organizing company that does consulting around trans rights in particular and progressive rights more generally. And some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight is going to be about that work in particular. So how do we convince people and sway people and win hearts and minds about trans rights? A couple other things about me that I'll drop in the chat as well. I am the co-author of the Advocate Educator's Handbook, a book about supporting trans and non-binary students in schools, and would definitely encourage folks to check that out. It is primarily, but not exclusively, directed at K through 12 educators. And last but not least, I have a piece in the Lambda award-winning collection, Too Trans, Too Furious, an extremely serious study of transgender street racing. If any of those things sound interesting, I would encourage you to check them out. We are going to talk a little bit first about the idea of messaging and talking points and sort of public communication in general. And then we're going to dig into trans rights specifically. And for the trans rights stuff, that's where we're going to be curious what people are saying in the chat or in the Q&A to see what might be the most useful or the most interesting. So anytime you are thinking about public communication, communication that's outside of your friends or your family, although that's great places to have these conversations too. But when you're thinking about that sort of communication with a message behind it or communication with a perspective behind it, I encourage you to think about the message. What are you saying? The messenger, who is saying it, and the audience, who is hearing it. And I have a little MMA cat there, which helps me remember it. I like the little cat doing MMA. So when you're thinking about the message, that's a bunch of what we're going to be talking about tonight. The what am I saying? But the other parts are also really important. Am I the right person to be saying this for this audience? Because I may share the same story, but framed differently or with different language if I'm speaking with an elected official versus a reporter from a local press versus a reporter from a national press versus a reporter from an LGBT outlet versus a high school GSA. All of those, I may talk about the same story or the same ideas, but how I talk about it is going to be different because of who the audience is, and how I talk about it is going to be different than if a friend of mine who was not transgender was talking about it. Might be different than if someone who had a child in school was talking about it, or who had gone to a school where there were particular policies. So again, we're thinking about what is the message and how might I need to tweak it based on who I am and who I'm talking to. And a couple of things connected to that. The stuff we're talking about tonight is not going to be as grounded in story, but I really, really, really want to encourage people to think about and remember that storytelling is the glue that holds this work together. And the reason for that is really kind of frustrating. We all want to think that we are convinced by data and facts and logic, but ironically, the data and facts and logic and surveys and studies show that we're not. We are convinced emotionally, and we remember emotionally. And so the stuff we're going to be talking about tonight, the framing, the language, the questions that you can ask, those are all super important. And my cat is yelling at me. And I want you to think about what personal stories might you share as a trans person or as a family member or as a community member who cares. Maybe you're not directly connected to trans people in your life, and that's okay too. And over time, this kind of work does have impacts. We know from the data, again, that when people have transgender people or people who are connected to transgender people in their lives, they're more likely to support trans rights. And that this persuasion, this idea of I'm going to share these things and we're going to have a conversation can and does work, but there's no one size fits all and it takes time. And those two are really frustrating, particularly because these conversations, especially on the one-on-one level, especially with friends and family, they can be hard. And it can feel, not only can feel, it is unfair that sometimes those of us who are the most impacted are the ones who get these questions. It can be unfair that a transgender person may be asked about prying issues by a stranger on the street who doesn't have the right to ask them that. And I'm saying it's an and, it's not a one or the other, unless we give people who aren't already with us grace and space to get there, they're never going to change. And so there's two things I want folks to balance on. It is never your responsibility to make yourself unsafe or put yourself in danger to try and win folks over. And if none of us do this work, we're in trouble. And then you need to figure out for yourself what risks are you comfortable with, and how are you doing this, and is it comfortable talking to this family member but not that family member, or I'm comfortable speaking directly with an elected official but not at a city council hearing. There are all sorts of ways you can do that. But we do need to make this grace and space to have conversations with people who don't necessarily agree with us. So we've talked a lot around this. We're now going to dig a little bit more into the actual messaging, some examples of what this looks like. And what movement messaging, what I mean when I say that, is there are all of these organizations, many of which you've heard of, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Greenpeace, or the Sierra Club, and the environmental movement. There are all sorts of organizations who make what are called messaging resources or talking points. So I'm going to put up two examples.
Yeah.
Pardon?
We have one.
You do. Amazing. Can you drop that link in the chat?
We sure can. Candace,
And so these are resources that organizations put together. On the left is the Movement Advancement Project, which focuses on LGBT messaging. The right is the Equality Federation's HIV media guidance. And these are tools that these organizations, often coalitions of organizations, put out to help advocates like the folks on this call have messaging and language to talk about these issues. Some of that helps because hopefully this stuff is backed by research and backed by data. Some of it helps so that we're on the same page. And so it feels like we're all pushing in the same direction, which the progressive movement sometimes does better than others. And so these movement messaging tools that we're going to talk about today are hugely valuable, and they have some shortcomings. So they can be slow to respond or update to what's happening in the world. These are often created with lots of rounds of edits and lots of rounds of feedback. And when that works really well, it means everyone's voice has been included and a lot of different perspectives have been considered. When it's less useful is when there's fast-moving news and that these movement messages may not respond to them. Similarly, something that's made by an organization based on the coasts, as someone who is proudly in Chicago in the Midwest, they may or may not resonate based on who the audience is. Again, thinking about if you know your faith community is just not going to work with some of the messaging we talk about tonight, that doesn't mean you should try and shoehorn it in. That means that it may not work for that audience, and you know your communities best. One of the things that I think about more and more as 2025 passes is that these organizations, these big national or state or local organizations, don't always want to say someone is acting in bad faith. As individuals, sometimes we can do that, but that the messaging resources we're going to talk about are not, these are often not the tools for that, because the organizations behind them don't like to say that so-and-so is full of expletive. Although I like that Jacqueline's saying in the chat that EducateUS does not have that problem. Amazing. And then last but not least, there may be gaps in research. So these organizations and individuals have areas that they might not be familiar with or things they just might not have thought of. And so again, it may be that, you know, an organization puts out a talking point document saying, or messaging saying, this works with the majority of people we spoke with, but they didn't speak with people who were in communities of color, or they didn't speak with people who were English as a second language, or they didn't speak with people who are immigrants. And so there can definitely be gaps in research. So now that we've talked a little bit about the structure, I want to start to get into the actual language. And we're going to talk about two things that I want to make sure everyone has, and then I'm going to pause to see what questions there might be or what topics we might want to dig into more to make sure we have lots of time for that. Yeah, please.
Just jump in about that. Encourage folks, you can go ahead now and start putting questions in the Q&A so that when Rebecca's done with this first part of the presentation, we already know what some of those questions are. You really encourage you to not wait.
So when we think about that, going back to the idea of connecting with people, of thinking about story, of thinking about why this issue is important to you, one of the things I'm going to really encourage everyone on the call to find for themselves is the idea of a core value statement. This is something positive that you're fighting for. It might be an I believe statement. It might be a we all agree statement. It should be something that you can come back to and that connects to why you're doing this work that you're doing. So I'm going to give some examples that are far from all of the ones you could think about, but I want to encourage people to think about what brings them to this work and why it's important to them, and how that might connect with someone else's values. So a couple of examples. I believe all families want what's best for their kids, including families with trans children. What's important to me is that all students, including trans students, have the right to participate in activities. We can all agree it's wrong to single out and attack anyone. I envision a society where private medical decisions are between doctors and patients. These are the types of statements that get to the why you are doing this work and what might connect with your audience. And the way you connect to these might be different depending on, as someone who has worked with young people for a long time, I might speak to, I've seen a lot of families and I believe that. If you're a parent, it might come from there. If you are a sibling to someone, or if you have members of your community, again, these aren't a one size fits all, but are things that you can think about and tools that you can use for yourself. One, to help ground you in whatever you're talking about, to remind yourself to stay calm, to give that grace and space. This is why I'm here. And two, to start to connect the issue to something larger than yourself. So you're seeing all of these talk about, well, I guess most of them, I guess the private medical decisions less so, but most of these talk about everyone, including transgender people. And depending on your audience, that can also tie to that. It can be everyone, regardless of whether or not someone is an immigrant or not, whether someone is a person of faith or not, whether someone is transgender or not. Depending on the audience and the population you're talking to, you can think about what's going to connect with them. And then the next thing I want to cover before I pause and we see what questions there are, or what other topics we might want to dig into, are some general talking points that may be useful on a number of different issues that are coming up around trans rights these days. So some general talking points are thinking about fairness, dignity, and respect. So I think the idea no one should face discrimination because of who they are. One thing that we're seeing can be effective is accurately linking these local or state level attacks to a nationwide movement. There is a nationwide effort. And depending on your audience, you can phrase by certain politicians or by extremists or by XYZ. Depending on where you are, it may be a specific organization or elected official or rabble rouser. And that these attacks harm us all because they limit our freedoms, and this is can particularly be resonant to start thinking about then how you're connecting with your audience. I want to be careful in how I talk about this. I don't think these attacks are a distraction, in the sense that I think these attacks are very real and that they deserve attention. I do think these attacks are used to pull focus from things that impact all of us to focus on a very small portion of us. And so thinking about how do we connect these political attacks, connect this nationwide movement, and think about this is not good for any of us, whether or not you personally are transgender. And then some other general talking points, thinking about that this doesn't align with our local or our state values, that we want everyone to thrive, that this community is fighting back with strength and courage, that we want to draw together. And all of these are different sort of general talking points that can touch on a number of different issues around trans rights. And I see there are a couple of questions in the chat that are in the Q&A that we can get to, and I'll pause, Jacqueline, to see if you have any thoughts or areas we can dig deeper.
No, you actually asked the question that I was going to ask, which is it effective to tie attacks on trans people to most people at this point's loathing of the current regime? And it sounds like the answer is yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that is, there are a lot of things weird and frustrating about the world we live in right now, but there was a lot of talk in the 2024 election. There were hundreds of millions of dollars spent on anti-trans ads trying to tie Harris or tie local races to pro-trans policies.
The
And
they them ads.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not clear they did a lot of work. It's just there is a very small, very, very loud group of people who are in hysterics about trans rights, and the vast majority of the country is either neutral or in favor, but it's much harder to get to that. So it's really just not clear that these attacks are politically effective, and so we do want to at least acknowledge and call them out for what they are.
Do you know, it's very interesting. It reminds me of one of the dynamics of advocating for sex ed overall, which is not an accident because the two issues are inextricably linked. But that we find that there's incredible support for sex ed. Like, I mean, incredible polling for support for sex ed. But there's this belief among the political class that it's a third rail and that it's an incredibly divisive issue. And it becomes much harder to do real advances on sex ed, not because there's not popular support for it, but because the politicians, even the ones who are supposed to be on our side, believe that it's a controversial issue and don't want to stick their neck out, et cetera, because the opposition is not a majority in most places, but they're loud and well funded. And so they know how to make themselves seem like a majority. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're describing.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
will say that my cat Meep has joined, and so we are now. Yeah, I think that's spot on. That um, there are not nearly as many vocal, loud defenders as
Yeah.
there are. Not to say there aren't defenders, and hopefully that's why folks are on this call. Yes, this is Meep. Um, in terms of some of the questions in the Q&A, so one is asking about responding to religious arguments. And that one, I first want to be honest that um, we are still learning about what is most impactful and most resonant with folks who really have faith-based or religious-based objections. I will say um, one way to talk about that is when we are in public government-funded institutions like schools, like libraries, like ID documents, that we don't want to give the government the tools to discriminate. And we don't want to give those institutions the tools to discriminate because inevitably those tools are used on more and more people. And um, we don't want to construct these tools or construct these restrictions that may eventually be used on that person. Um, that's certainly not going to convince everyone. I've similarly seen people talk about for schools specifically that no one is trying to control what you or your child think. We are saying when you are at school, this is the language we're using to refer to each other. That doesn't always feel good because we're that may not be an effective response. Um, I would also say that religion is an area where it can be very important to have folks within the community talking to each other. So there may be communities as like a lefty, mostly secular Jew that I'm just not going to be the right messenger. Going that back to that idea of message, messenger, and audience.
I think that's really true. You know, when we were lobbying in Massachusetts for a sex ed bill a few sessions ago, I mean, we're still lobbying for that bill, but that's a different conversation. But we put together a faith leader briefing for legislators. And we made sure to not only bring in the Jews and the UUs and the folks that you would expect would be on our side and that the legislators wouldn't be swayed by, but also to get Methodists and Episcopalians and like people who are willing to wear their collars. There are folks coming from in let's say it's mostly Christianity. It's not just religion. I think we have to say that out loud. I think Candace, who is in fact a pastor, would agree with that. And that's to my point. You know, Candace. So you need people who can speak to this is not Christian. There are Christians who can speak to that, who have standing inside the church. And I think that asking about who's the right messenger in that case is really important.
I see a larger question about debunking myths and then a couple of specific questions about specific perspectives. So I feel like that might be a useful way to um, hit a couple of these questions. So in terms of debunking myths in general, um, if it's someone who you think of as an ally or who thinks of themselves and wants to be an ally, it can be helpful to ask those why questions to try and get under what is the concern. So, um, why would it be a problem if XYZ happened? And sometimes that can help by saying, well, that concern has already been addressed. You know, a lot of these concerns around medical care and youth transition, those concerns are already like these are things happening under doctor's care with careful evaluation and with adults involved in the process. Um, and so the thing that they may be worried about may be something that is already addressed and taken care of. If it is a broader question or if it's something that feels less in your wheelhouse, it's always okay to say, I'm not an expert, but. And the but can be going back to some of those core values. But I think we should treat people with respect, not discrimination. But I think we're better when we listen to people when they tell us who they are. But I think all parents, or I hope that all parents want what's best for their children. So I think that can be some general ways to push back against myths. If it's someone you have the relationship with, I think you can also ask, so what data or what examples would be enough to prove that this thing isn't happening, that this issue isn't the concern that you seem to have. Jacqueline, I'm curious what you would think about myth
Yeah,
busting.
I was just going to add yes to all of that, but one thing that we learn from deep canvassing is a lot of times people would believe misinformation because it aligns with what is already going on for them emotionally, right? Like this issue gives them the ick. It makes them uncomfortable for whatever reason. They have not investigated that reason. And then they hear something that's like, I have justification for my feelings. And when that's going on, you're not going to convince them to let go of the disinformation until you help them process the stuff that's going on underneath. So I often recommend not even pushing hard on debunking myths to start with, but to sort of drill down on what I think Rebecca said first, which is like find out like why do you feel strongly about this? Like why does this matter to you? Like what and see if you can get them to tell you a story. We talked about the power of you telling a story is even more powerful if you can get them to tell you a story about why they feel so charged up about this. And listen for not to jump in, not to correct them, don't correct them. Listen as non-judgmentally as you can possibly do it, and listen for shared values that you can connect across and to really understand where they're coming from. And sometimes that can help them process undigested stuff. That once they process it, they can hear it differently, or they even sometimes hear themselves go say something and they're like, oh, I just heard that. And then like the penny will drop. So a lot of times people who are dug in on believing this information don't want to let it go and aren't going to let it go no matter how many facts you present them because they have some undigested emotions. And the best thing you can do is help them digest their emotions.
I really like that framing of the undigested emotions. That's helpful. Um, the I see a question of a pushback about education and athletics participation. So I want to pull up some um, possible language to use. And again, this is not going to be language that's perfect for every situation. This is not going to be language that's perfect for every messenger. Don't feel like these are written in stone. These are tools to have in your toolbox. But first, a bad joke. Why did the non-binary prospector go mining in the mountains? Obviously, because there's gold in them there hills. I'm a bad person and no one can stop me from making dad jokes. All right. So sports and athletics. Some general things I would think about for anyone talking about athletics and trans participation is that most trans athletes, like most athletes in general, are not elite athletes. Most athletes are playing in recreational leagues or in after school clubs or in pickup games at the park or at the beach. And so the vast majority of athletic situations, they're just playing to have fun. It's not, it hopefully is not a crisis. Um, that said, when we're specifically talking about trans athletes, it's not good to exclude people who are different. And that the way that exclusion happens is invasive monitoring and testing. And so this is a place where potentially at any level, but especially in youth athletics, which we'll talk about in just a second, who is doing this monitoring? Who in the government is responsible for determining who gets to be a man and who gets to be a woman? And why is that a good way to structure our society? And that can sometimes get into some of these deeper issues of people have very athletics is an issue that resonates with many people because we all have some experience of athletics, whether it was in school or in our adulthood or watching it on TV or seeing ads for things or hearing ads on streaming or Spotify or whatever. And also everyone has an intuitive but not always thought through idea of what it means to be fair. And so these are athletics is a situation where unlike medical or unlike legal issues, it's easier for people to say, well, I have just as much a right to talk about this as anyone else. And so one of the ways we can get at that is first reminding why do we play athletics? Who's going to be responsible for picking these things? And then particularly for determining gender and what gives them the authority and the responsibility to do that? And why is that a good thing for society? And then digging a little bit more specifically in youth, again, athletics for youth are primarily about things other than who wins and who loses. They're about leadership, they're about hard work, they're about teamwork, they're about winning gracefully and losing gracefully. And that the vast majority of trans students, and going back to, again, like any other students, just want to participate. There's some possible language there, particularly if you're a parent. And then there's one thing in that last one that I want to highlight particularly, that it can be okay to say, I know these can be hard to understand. I know it took a while. I know, if you are a parent or if you are an adult who's working with trans people, you can say, it took me a while to learn this too. Giving that permission to not know.
I would even double down on that if I can interrupt your flow here and say
Please.
we found that um, modeling a journey story, like you started off not understanding this issue either, and you came to understand it, can be one of the most powerful things that you can do on any trans issue, is sort of saying, I get it. I get starting with not knowing or confusion or discomfort or what have you. I started there too, and here's why and how I shifted. And it helps people understand that it's okay that they're not coming from a quote unquote perfect place, and it helps sort of reduce defensiveness so people can really hear.
Absolutely. And giving people permission to be like, yeah, I don't get this. Or yeah, this is confusing. Or yeah, I don't understand why we need XYZ. Absolutely. Um, in terms of, I want to say one more thing about youth and athletics, and then specifically the question in the Q&A asking about environments being less safe and equitable. A couple of thoughts that are not these have not been tested with members of the public. So these are things that I've been thinking about, but I don't want to pretend that these are answers that are going to persuade or resonate with every single person. One is thinking about scarcity versus abundance, not the book abundance, but the idea abundance. That one of the concerns that's brought up is things like scholarships. If we funded college for everyone, then that would be less of a concern. Not to distract or diminish that that's not the only concern, but that if everyone had health care, it would be less of an issue if trans people were getting health care. And so I think to some extent thinking about fairness and thinking about what equity means and thinking about why are sports a proxy for being able to pay for college.
Sorry, are you, before you move on from youth sports, I want to say a thing, but I don't want to interrupt you.
The last thing I was going to say about youth sports is that if this was going to be an issue, we would have seen it already because for a decade or so now, um, young people have been transitioning and adults have been transitioning and playing in sports, and adults have been transitioning for a lot longer than a decade, but there has not been this groundswell of trans athletes beating out cis athletes. Um, Even if there were, I think there's a larger question of it is considered positive for a baseball player to be left-handed, or for a basketball player to be tall, or for Michael Phelps to have biologically identifiable and noticeably different body in a way that makes him better at swimming than any of us will ever be. Those things are considered strengths, but if I, as a trans woman, try to participate in sports, that's considered cheating by some. And so I think those are just larger questions that I've been thinking about. And as someone said in the chat, there is absolutely bodies that have historically moved the goalposts to exclude people they don't want to participate.
The one thing I wanted to add, and you sort of touched on this already, but I wanted to double click on it, is I've seen some really powerful communications with young cis women, young cis girls talking about being gender policed in the interest of policing whether someone is trans or not. And I hate that we live in a world where we have to appeal to people's concern for young white cis girls in order to protect trans people. But if it gets the job done, it can possibly, in terms of who's the messenger, like in order to police gender, you're going to wind up doing invasive shit to young girls of all gender histories, right? Like, and so I think that that can be a powerful argument also. Like, who do you want inspecting your daughter's underwear?
I would definitely encourage folks to check out. There was a John Oliver Last Week Tonight episode, I think this season, maybe last season, where he did a deep dive on athletics and trans people. And there's an absolutely delightful clip of a mom who's like, my trans daughter is awful at sports, but she loves it and she should be allowed to participate. Anyway, a couple of other questions that came up in the chat. One about parents' rights and challenging student privacy. So language that I've seen around that is acknowledging and reminding that we want all students to be in homes that are safe and loving, and that unfortunately that isn't the case. And so thinking about when we're talking about student privacy versus parents' rights, and I don't think it's a versus, or I don't think it has to be a versus, but that it sometimes can feel that way. If we have if there is an assumption or a suspicion that a student is saying, telling this information to my parents is going to make me less safe, not more, that can be one way to approach that. Parents' rights at some point gets into larger questions of in the United States, there's not a ton of respect for bodily autonomy of young people, or the idea that under 18, um, there is it is very fraught to talk about bodily autonomy for anyone under the age of 18, and our society sort of defaults to the parents get to make those decisions. And without pretending that it is easy to make those calls or pretending that there is a clear line that should always be drawn for every person. Part of what that ties back to is we want every child to be safe. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And we want to help children grow into the best versions of themselves. We want to help young people grow into the best versions of themselves. And what is a school's role in that? And again, I would argue that in this case, the school's role is not to reveal that personal student information to the parents.
We have one last question in the Q&A, which is about the term intersex.
I will say, as someone who is not intersex, I want to be careful, and I'm going to couch my answer by saying, as I said earlier, encouraging you to say, I am not an expert there. My understanding is that what used to be called and sort of historically was called hermaphrodite um, has been shifted into intersex or disorders of sexual development for terms for people who have a bunch of conditions. Those are both sort of umbrella terms, intersex and disorders of sexual development, for people who either when the doctor was born, the doctor couldn't say clearly it's a boy or it's a girl, which is how most babies are gendered and sexed in the United or around the world. Um, and or later in life, there was something that is different about that person around their hormone development or how their body processes hormones or their sex chromosomes. And that can cause a range of impacts on the body ranging from very big to very small. My understanding is that intersex or disorders of sexual development are the preferred term over hermaphrodite, and that broadly speaking, again, this is not my community, and that I don't want to say that this is how everyone feels. My understanding is that intersex is used more by folks who see that as a part of their identity, and that disorders of sexual development is used more by folks who see it as a medical condition that has been or is being treated. Again, that doesn't mean that everyone uses those terms that way. Whether or not those terms are useful for people who are opposed to trans rights is a trickier question. And there have definitely been, in some of the anti-trans bills that have been passed, they will explicitly say, so a number of the bills that say you can't offer gender affirming care to minors, or you can't offer, cross-sex hormones to minors, will say, unless it is to treat a medical condition like being intersex or disorders of sexual development. So
Oh,
the
they're trying to pitch you against each other. Uh-huh.
yeah, so these state legislatures are saying trans people can't have this, but it's okay and in some hospitals mandatory for intersex people to have this treatment. And that sucks for a bunch of reasons, not least of which is that it can potentially pit communities against each other.
We have another question about sports.
For sports athletics, have you found highlighting that trans men and non-binary folks are ignored makes an impact? The majority of the anti-talking points are about trans women, non-binary folks. So the the first level of concern that a lot of people have about athletics is about trans women or trans girls, people like me who are assigned male at birth and identify as female, playing sports against cis women, quote unquote, real women or girls. And talking about participation by trans men or non-binary folks who are mask of center is important because trans men get left out of the conversation sometimes. And absolutely, we want to make sure that not all trans people are trans women. Not all trans athletes are trans women. And I'm not sure that that gets at what that concern is. I think at a deeper level, sometimes these concerns have larger worries about gender, larger worries about society, larger worries about how kids today are different than they were in the past, whether or not those things are true or whether or not those concerns are true. And from there, having a conversation that more trans people exist than just trans women, that might be really useful or valuable to talk about that this is a larger community and a larger experience than maybe that person thought. If the specific concern about athletics is about fairness, quote unquote, or about safety, quote unquote, I'm not sure that that's going to sway anyone, but doesn't mean that again, particularly if you're having those one-on-one conversations, it may still be useful to have.
All right, we are currently done with questions. Do you want, I know you have a little more in your slideshow that you can lay on us. Do you think you have time to get into it?
Perfect. Let's do it.
Okay.
First one, how many trans people does it take to screw in a light bulb?
Oh,
It should be
you
light
haven't
bulb.
started sharing again.
Oh, I haven't started sharing again. Oh, well. How many trans people does it take to screw in a light bulb? That should say light bulb. And the answer is only one, but she needs notes from two different doctors. That is a joke for those who are not aware that historically, when trans people have gotten gender reassignment surgery, sex reassignment surgery, whatever you want to call it, they have needed notes from multiple therapists and doctors. All right, a couple of quick things that I do want to talk about as we wrap up. Pivoting is the idea that sometimes a question may be poorly framed or inappropriate or a gotcha question. And that doesn't mean necessarily that the question is bad or unfair or asked in bad faith. Sometimes it's not. It's as Jacqueline talked about earlier, there can be questions that are totally reasonable questions, but just not in the space you're in. If you are asked one of those, I would encourage you to think about pivoting. And this is the idea of a lot of the time when we are engaging in public advocacy, it's not a social conversation. And what I mean by that is if I were hanging out with friends and they asked what I did this weekend, and I said, you know, the important thing is to contribute to our local economies. That would be a wildly strange answer, and my friends would have deep concerns. If I am advocating on behalf of a local business, that might be an appropriate question if I'm in an interview. And so thinking about public advocacy, if you're talking with, certainly with a reporter, often with elected officials, and sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes if you're choosing to engage that way with a family member, or a friend, or a coworker, you can think about how do I get away from and not dive into this question and get us back to where I wanted to go. And so I would encourage you to have in your pocket a pivot phrase. Sometimes these are called bridge phrases. And you don't need to remember, I would say maybe one or two. I'd rather listen to, someone mentioned this earlier, I'd rather listen to the experts. And what I'm hearing is blah, 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 blah. You know, if someone is talking about a myth or a concern that feels unrealistic, getting back to, you know, the real issue is we need to listen to this community, and the community is saying blank. What I'd like to focus on is my own experience, which shows me that whatever. And what I want you to think about is you have permission, and not only permission, but I am encouraging you to say, I don't know, let me connect you with someone better. Or I need a minute to think about that question. Or if it's not a time-bound conversation, if it's with a friend or a family member or a coworker, to be able to say, I actually want to think about that and get back to you. It's okay to say, I want to have this conversation, but not right now. If you're in a more time-bound situation, if you're meeting with an elected official and only have a certain amount of time, or with a reporter, or talking with a client or a patient, and you know they only have a certain amount of time, these can also be helpful to get yourself back on message, get yourself back on focus. It can be really great to go back to those value statements we talked about earlier. The real question is, how are we going to take care of all of our students, including our transgender students? What I'm concerned about is the families with trans youth that I'm hearing from who are experiencing XYZ. I also, I drink lots and lots of water I like being hydrated, but I also love having water bottles because it's a great way to say, oh, that's an interesting question. Let me think about that. And then you can kill a little time and buy yourself some room to think about it. But I would always encourage you to say, let me get back to you, or I need to think about that, or I want to connect you with an expert, or just that's not what I'm here to talk about. If I'm being asked to speak about, I don't know, if I'm being asked to speak about a school censorship bill that would block LGBTQ material from the school library, and someone asks me about whether or not I've had any surgeries, I'm going to not answer that question. I also probably wouldn't answer if they asked about, you know, what do I think the water policy should be in Chicago? Because I'm not there to talk about that, and I don't know how to answer those questions. So I would encourage you to think about not only what do you want to talk about, but where are the areas that either for personal comfort and safety, or just lack of knowledge or interest, you're going to not talk about. One last slide, and then we can start wrapping things up. And I see there's one more question in the Q&A. Some final tips and tricks to think about. Again, going back to that first message, messenger, and audience, think about who you are there to speak on behalf of. It might be yourself, it might be a community or an organization. Again, think about that message, messenger, and audience. I like the language of theater. I have a theater background. I was a theater kid. And so I would encourage you to think about rehearsing. Practice makes things less scary. And in particular, I love notes. I would encourage you to, I have notes up on my screen right now. If you're going somewhere to present or to speak with someone, you can bring written notes or bullet points or a full script. I would encourage you to use that and say those things out loud. Writing something down or reading it over in your head is not the same as saying it to the mirror or in the bathroom or in the shower or when you're walking the dog or when you're walking to work. I would really encourage you to, or find a friend or a colleague and say, hey, can I read this out loud to you before I call this elected official or before I meet with the committee from the city council or before I start sharing this information with patients. Think about who you want to talk to and who you want to practice with first. And again, something we've touched on a couple times now, it is okay to not know everything. I have two phrases that I like to keep that I will share. One is no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And so think about where your area is and what you're going to try to do. And then I am not a runner. I don't like the marathon versus sprint metaphor, the end of the story of marathon, the runner dies. I don't want to do that. It's not a solo, it's a chorus. Because at any point in a chorus, if you need to catch your breath, there are going to be other people there to keep the music going. And so I do, again, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And when you need to catch your breath, there are going to be others there to keep it going. I do see there's one more question that I want to get to, but as we're starting to wrap up, want to thank everyone and see if there are other questions. Yeah, so a couple more questions. One, what is the strongest analogy to other rights movements? So I would be really careful when using analogies between different fights for people's civil rights. I think every fight for rights that I can think of, from the fight for Black civil rights in the 50s and 60s, so the sort of the civil rights movement, to thinking about the suffragette movement, to thinking about movements for disability access and rights. Every immigrant rights, every movement I can think of has some parallels to the trans rights movement. As someone who's not a member of those communities, I would be really careful about when and how I use those analogies. I have seen it go very, very poorly, for example, when someone who is white talks about parallels with bathroom laws between what's happening to trans people now and what was happening to Black people in the Jim Crow South. Whether or not that's a valid analogy, that messenger was the wrong person to be making that point. And so I would be really careful with analogies. As someone who is Jewish, I like to talk about one of the things I love about being trans and one of the things I love about being Jewish is every person who is a part of those communities has a different definition of what it means to be a part of those communities. And I love that both Judaism and it feels like in the trans community, you get two together, you get three opinions. Lots of disagreement and debate within the communities. But that's really as far as I would push around analogies for my identities. And so I would think for yourself, what are places that feel relevant and important to you in terms of your identities, and how can you draw those analogies there?
Rebecca, in terms of the other question, I wonder if there's a resource we can drop in the chat because I want to make sure respect everyone's time and end on time. Do you have anything to like super briefly say, or is there a link that you could somewhere you could point this person?
Yes, I'm gonna. What I would say to this person, so the question is when people bring up laws or policies, what's a good way we can talk about the kind of protections that matter most to trans people? I would say the real answer is it depends on the trans person, because for some trans people, labor laws are going to be the most important. For some trans people, housing laws are going to be the most important. For some trans people, non-discrimination laws are going to be the most important. For some trans people, it's going to be none of those things and it's going to be something else I haven't thought of. I would encourage folks to check out if you Google, and I'll drop the link in the chat as well, Movement Advancement Project Maps, the organization MAP, Movement Advancement Project, has a bunch of different state level maps where you can see in your state where you live what laws there are that do or don't support LGBTQ rights. And it shows about relationships and parental recognition, and about non-discrimination laws, and about religious exemption laws, and about youth policies, and about healthcare laws and policies. And I'm sorry for giving you homework.
No, they're asking for
And
homework. So, but I do want to wrap it up.
yes,
So I really Laura, she just put the link in the chat. It's right there. Um, I want to say a huge thank you, and I want to say if you enjoyed Rebecca, if you got something out of this, you can hire Rebecca to come help you with your work in more depth. I'm sure Rebecca's going to drop the link for that, and also you can buy her book. There are lots of ways you can support Rebecca's work and get more of this incredible insight. And I highly encourage you to do so. Also, if you appreciated this, you could make a donation to Educate Us, $5, $10. It doesn't have to be a lot to make a big difference. And finally, thank you to all of you for caring enough. I know we talked about this earlier, but this is an issue where more people speaking up can make a huge difference because we are the majority, but we're not sticking our necks out as loudly and as effectively as the minority. And if we can pierce the perception that this is actually a controversial issue, we could make enormous change for all of us, not for trans people especially, and for all of us. So please keep speaking up in whatever ways you can. We really appreciate you taking time tonight. And this will be up on YouTube in the next few days, and we'll let you know when it's live. So Rebecca, thank you. We can't thank you enough.
absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. And thank you all for your questions, your participation, and for your advocacy.
Have a good night, everyone.